Hi, I'm Stephanie Sebbing with Quilt Addicts Anonymous, and today we're going to be teaching you how to make block 4 in the dimensions block of the month. Block 4 is actually a setting triangle that we use to help start making those corners that will set around our medallion center. So we have a lot of them to make, but they're not hard. So I'm going to show you how to cut them so that way your triangles will continue to have that ombre going from top to bottom. It's really cool. Let's check it out. So when you first cut out your fabrics, you're going to end up with this sort of color change going from this deep green to this lighter green. What I suggest doing is keeping them in color order as you're going along, and that way it's easier to tell, because it's harder to tell, which one of these two are darker. It's a lot easier to tell when you just keep them in line as you go up. So what you want to do to cut this, because we want to keep it so that the color change is going from the bottom of your block to the top of your block, because that creates this really cool effect that makes this quilt really awesome. So we need to actually cut our triangle out so that way we can do our quarter square triangles like this. So here's how you do that. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your 6.5 inch ruler and you're going to line the 45-degree line up with the bottom of your rectangle. So that's going to be the part that's the darkest. It's a little harder to tell on this one. It's a little easier to tell on this one. There's a clear color change here. So I've got it lined up with that bottom, and then the very point is lined up with the very point of that rectangle. So the bottom right corner. So now I'm going to take and I'm going to slice off this corner, put that to the side. So now I need to cut off this other end. So I'm just going to turn it this way. And again, I'm going to line up that 45-degree line up with the bottom, even though the bottom is now on the side here. And then the point is going to be on the side. And so you can see when we cut this, we're going to end up with something that looks like a quarter square triangle. So I'm going to go ahead and trim that off as well. And we're going to save these guys because we're going to use them to create a cool improv piece pillow at the very end. So now I've got something that looks more like this, which is going to show up in our setting triangle. So that's pretty cool. So you need to go ahead and do this with the rest of your blocks so that way you have the nice color change to work with as you go here. Alright, so we can set these to the side. We won't need them until later. So for this next part, what I want to do is I want to pair up my lightest with my darkest. So I'm going to take my lightest ones and my darkest ones and start putting them together in that fashion. And you kind of have to pay attention to your pattern book so that you know which way to go, because there is a specific order to where the light and dark go in order to make this work the way you want it to go. The main thing to keep in mind is that you have a light next to a dark, and so that you have that clear contrast. So as long as you work from those centers in, then you're going to be able to do that when you put these together. So now I need to sew these together, and for this step I'm going to use a scant 1/4 inch seam because I'm going to trim these down later once my triangles are all together so I have a nice even size. So what I've done is I've set my sewing machine so that it will sew a 1/4 inch stitch, and then I'm going to move my needle position one position to the right, and that gets it just a little bit closer to the edge of that presser foot so that you have a little bit tinier seam, and you're much less likely to, or much more likely to have a successful block when you're done, because everything will turn out the right size. Alright, so I'm just going to put these two together. And really that's all there is to it. I've just got to do that with the rest of these two, and then that part of the block will be done. really prefer to press seams flat when I'm doing these types of triangles. I find that everything lays a lot flatter that way when you're putting your final block together, which makes for more accurate points and just a nicer looking quilt overall. So to do that, instead of pushing the seams from one side to or another, I just open that seam up with my fingertip, put the center of my iron right in the middle of that seam, and just drag it up. And I usually will also press it from the other side just to get that really good and flat. We'll do that with this one too. What I need to do next is cut my square in half so that I have a half square triangle. And if you followed my videos, you know that I really like to do all these from squares to start with, but for this pattern, the ombre just doesn't work right if you do that method. So we're doing it a little bit different way, getting out of our box, and it's kind of fun doing it that way. Okay, so I've got all of my quarter square triangles sewn together, and it's important to note that we are not sewing anything to these bottom ones because that's what's going to attach to the border surrounding the medallion star. So we're going to have a big half square triangle for this block. For this one though, we are going to sew this green piece to the gray piece. To do that, we're just going to flip those guys right sides together, and it's important to note that the gray triangle is just a tad bit larger than the green one. That's because I did the math on this, so it's about 1/8 inch larger than we need, so we have a little bit to cut down to make sure we have a nice square point to work with. These are already going to be the size we need, although I do recommend trimming off your dog ears so that way you have less to sew in and your quilt can lay a little bit flatter. So I'm still using the scant 1/4 inch seam for this. That's just so my seam is just a tad bit skinnier so that I have just a little bit more room to play when I go to trim everything up. Sew that across, and be careful when you're sewing these because you are working on the bias. And the bias is just a tad bit stretchier than when you're working on the straight grain, like with squares or rectangles. So you just want to make sure you're not stretching out that fabric. So I'm going to press this part open as well. And what I'm going to do here is just open that seam up with my fingernail. Put the tip of my iron right in the center of that seam. And just guide across like that. Now when you're done, your seam should be really straight like this. If it has a wobble in it, then it means there's a wobble on the other side too, and you won't have a nice straight half square triangle. So just make sure that everything is nice and straight, and then everything will turn out the size that you need. All right, so I'm going to show you how to trim this up. All right, first we're going to just go ahead and trim off those dog ears. You can do this with your scissors, of course, or you can just get a little snip with your dog ears like that, and then they're out of the way and you don't have to worry about it. So now for this one, this square, you've got some playing to do here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line this up so that the 45-degree line of my ruler is going across this major seam here, and that's that major seam between the half square triangle. And the other thing I'm paying attention to is where my 4.5 inch mark is. Now on this side, where the math I made it so that it's exact, it should be going exactly on the edge of your triangle and the top of it. I've got a little bit hanging out here, so that means there's maybe a little bit of stretch on that bias, but it's okay. And then where the 4.5 inch dotted line meets the end should be exactly where the point is for these two quarter square triangles coming together. That will ensure that your point is where it's supposed to be in the end. So I've got all that in line. So now I'm going to go ahead and trim off my side and the top. And then I'm going to flip that around. And now we're going to look for a couple other points as we are measuring. We just trimmed this, so we need to have our 4.5-inch line exactly on the edge that we just trimmed. The 45-degree line is still going across the center. Again, that makes sure that this corner is going to end up exactly where it's supposed to be and you won't cut off any points. And again, this should already be exactly in line with the edge of your quarter square triangle because the math on those were exact. The only thing you should have to cut off is your dog ear. And then I just have a little sliver to trim here. And there we go. We have a perfect quarter square triangle or pinwheel, whatever you want to call it. And it's all our points are going straight to the edge and it's the exact size that we need for this block. So now we can start sewing this together. This block goes together a little bit different than you may be used to because it stays as a half square. So that way we have those setting triangles. I am going to pin with this, but just a tiny little bit. So what I want to make sure is when I flip this right sides together, that these two triangles meet at the same spot. So to do that, I usually lift it up so that it's facing me, and then I just kind of pull it apart and I make sure that those seams are right on top of each other, that I can see that this seam line is right in the same place as that one. And then I'm going to put a pin on the right side of that seam allowance so that it doesn't shift in the time it takes me to get it from here to the sewing machine. So now we're done with the part where we need to potentially trim something away. So I want to change my sewing machine back to a regular 1/4-inch stitch so that way I have that accuracy and everything else will turn out the size it's supposed to be. So I'm going to take those first few stitches with that pin still in, just to anchor that in place. So that way the thread and the needle is now acting as a pin and I'm okay to remove that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to line everything up, and just like we had those dog ears that were sticking out, we're also going to have some dog ears sticking out here at the bottom when we're sewing them together. So your tip of your triangle should be extending past your square. You can see how taking that little extra step to pin was a really good move because those seams are just coming together perfectly. I'm really happy with that join. All right, we've got one more to add. And again, this point is going to extend beyond, and that's okay. That's what we want to have happen. So I'm going to go ahead and flip these together, and then I'm going to pin these two seams. So same deal, I kind of lift it up and I pull them apart to make sure that those seams are lining up. I want my center seam and on both sides to be right on top of each other. And then I'm going to put a pin in the right side of that seam allowance to hold that together. So when I sew this, I'm going to take my first couple of stitches to anchor that seam in place and then remove my pin. Now that that seam is locked in place. Now we can start sewing our 1/4-inch seam. And then when we get down to the bottom here, our needle should be coming right out where this little valley is in between our pieces. And if you've done that, you've done it right. We're going to go ahead and press the seam open as well. Once you have all these seams, sometimes your iron can blend going the other way. So make sure that you're paying attention to make sure you're not accidentally like flipping up one of these, or like this one got flipped up. You want to have nice flat seams so you can have a nice flat quilt. I'm going to hit that from this side as well. And I am really liking these joins. This one came together really well as well. It's just a little off, but you're not really going to be able to tell once it's all quilted together. So the last thing you may want to do is just go ahead and snip off your little dog ears there and here, and that way you just have a little bit less when you're putting everything together for the final quilt. Just like with the other blocks, I'm going to give this a little bit of spritz with Mary Ellen's Best Press to help it lay nice and flat, so that way we have a really perfect quilt when everything's all said and done. You can really see the difference with how flat this block is now versus what it was before when I pressed it. It's as flat as can be. Those seams are really not bulky at all. So if you ever have problems with like your needles breaking as you're getting in the corner, this is a really great way to avoid that. So this is it, block 4 in Dimensions, Quilt Addicts Anonymous block of the month. I really love the Kinkame shades that we're using this month. Those greens are just, it's not so much of a color change in the individual squares, like there isn't any one really dramatic triangle where you can really see it change, but the colors are so different and it really makes it look like you were a rock star, but you had one Kinkame shades and one solid. So that's really neat. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button so that way you know when new videos are coming out from us, so you can learn lots of tips and tricks on how to become a better quilter. We also have a whole bunch that you can check out over at quiltaddictsanonymous.com. Just click on the tutorials page and you can read our blog and learn lots of great quilting tips and tricks. You can get the pattern for this as well as a limited supply of kits over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. Thanks so much for following along and happy quilting!